In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich teetered on the edge of collapse, American soldiers faced a challenge unlike any they had encountered on the battlefield. The war in Europe was ending, yet the final encounters were not with tanks or artillery, but with arrogance and entitlement. High-ranking German generals and SS commanders arrived at POW camps not with humility, heads bowed, or hands raised in surrender. Instead, they arrived in luxury cars, impeccably dressed, and carrying themselves as though they were visiting a social club rather than submitting to the victors of a devastating conflict. Their expectations were staggering. They demanded salutes, private quarters, and the respect of a gentleman's war, as if the rules of civility somehow still applied to men responsible for orchestrating one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. American soldiers, many of whom had endured months of grueling combat, witnessed the collapse of cities and the retreat of German armies, found this arrogance almost incomprehensible. A simple salute, a gesture steeped in military tradition, meant to honor discipline, skill, and courage, suddenly became a moral and psychological test. How could they honor men who had engineered mass murder, enforced slave labor, and sent millions to death camps? These were not ordinary prisoners, they were architects of terror, yet they demanded recognition, expecting the discipline of the American military to bend to their delusions of dignity. When these German officers spoke, they did so with the air of entitlement. They recounted their campaigns and strategies as if they were debating sportsmanship, completely disconnected from the human suffering their actions had caused. Some even attempted to lecture the Americans on military decorum, offering thinly veiled critiques of how the Allies conducted themselves. Their self-image clashed violently with the reality that surrounded them: cities in ruins, civilians displaced, and soldiers who had seen firsthand the horrors of the Nazi regime. The contrast between their polished appearance and the atrocities they had enabled could not have been more stark. American soldiers, trained to respect rank and protocol, were suddenly faced with a dilemma. Military discipline demanded a certain courtesy, yet moral clarity demanded defiance. Many documented these encounters meticulously, noting the arrogance, the demands, and the casual detachment from the suffering that lay everywhere around them. Some soldiers recalled standing silently as generals issued imperious commands, their hands gesturing for attention, expecting deference. Others reported that officers tried to assert their superiority even in confinement, arranging quarters like hotel suites, demanding additional rations, and insisting on privileges normally reserved for visiting dignitaries. The tension was electric. Guards and soldiers whispered among themselves, anger simmering beneath a veneer of calm. They understood that this was not merely a matter of etiquette, it was a confrontation with the moral center of the war itself. These men were asking for honor they had forfeited, respect they had destroyed through decades of cruelty, and recognition they did not deserve. Every glance, every gesture, every request for privilege became an act of provocation, a test of resolve. The stakes were not merely symbolic. How the Americans responded would send a clear message about who truly held authority and who determined justice. Could they bend to the expectations of men who had wrought unimaginable suffering, or would they assert the moral authority of victory, enforcing the principle that actions, not rank or self-importance, determine respect? In that charged atmosphere, the POW camps became a theater of psychological confrontation. The generals believed they were still in control, still commanding respect, yet every silent refusal, every deliberate act of restraint chipped away at their delusion. In these first tense encounters, the stage was set for a larger reckoning. The soldiers understood that true victory was not measured only in territory or the surrender of armies, but in the assertion of justice, in the quiet power of principle over arrogance. They were about to deliver a lesson that would resonate far beyond the camp fences, a message that the most dangerous weapon of all could be the refusal to grant undeserved honor. The question lingered in every mind. How do you confront men who demand respect they have long since forfeited? The answer would arrive not with words or violence, but through deliberate, controlled, and morally resolute action, setting the tone for the final chapters of the war and leaving an enduring mark on history. Even as the German generals demanded respect and deference, American soldiers quickly began to see the fragility behind their polished uniforms and imperious gestures. These officers clung to the idea that the war had been fought honorably, that a code of conduct among soldiers, what they called a gentleman's war, existed even in the midst of global conflict. They spoke of battlefield strategy, of careful planning and discipline, as if these discussions could erase the horrors they had enabled. For the Americans, this illusion was not only frustrating but grotesque. They had liberated towns where civilians had been executed, witnessed villages burned, and discovered evidence of systematic terror, yet here were men insisting that the rules of civility still applied. Conversations with these officers often revealed an astonishing level of cognitive dissonance. Some would discuss military logistics with pride, detailing maneuvers and counterattacks, all while ignoring the human cost of their campaigns. They spoke of honor among soldiers, while ignoring the millions they had murdered or enslaved. American soldiers noted the absurdity, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with seething anger. One lieutenant remembered an SS general insisting on formal greetings, while only a few miles away survivors of concentration camps were still being processed and cared for. The disconnect was staggering. Reports from multiple camps paint a consistent picture. Generals would inspect their assigned quarters as though entering a five-star hotel, demanding comforts they did not earn. Officers expected soldiers to salute automatically, to refer to them with formal titles, and to treat their claims to status as unassailable fact. In response, many Americans began to quietly observe and record every interaction. These notes later became crucial evidence of the absurdity and arrogance that persisted even in defeat. The myth of the gentleman's war also extended beyond behavior to self-image. These officers saw themselves as professionals, as caretakers of military tradition, as men whose reputation should be preserved even in surrender. Yet soldiers began to notice cracks in this facade. Subtle gestures betrayed unease, hesitation when confronted with simple orders, discomfort when stripped of expected privileges, and glances that sought validation but found none. The Americans realized that this insistence on ceremonial respect was more than entitlement. It was an attempt to reclaim dignity in a world that had irrevocably turned against them. Despite the absurdity, American soldiers maintained discipline. They understood that outright mockery could backfire, that the moral high ground depended on controlled, deliberate action. Yet the tension was palpable. Some officers tried to appeal to supposed military tradition, citing treaties and regulations, while soldiers patiently enforced camp rules, refusing to give in. The psychological effect was profound. The men who had believed themselves untouchable were now vulnerable to the quiet, unwavering authority of those they had considered inferior. The small victories, the refusal to salute, the denial of private accommodations, and the insistence on equal treatment became emblematic of a deeper confrontation. Each act, however subtle, was a statement of moral clarity, a demonstration that authority and honor were earned, not demanded. What emerged was a slow, almost surgical dismantling of the German officers' self-perception. By withholding salutes, denying special privileges, and enforcing strict equality within the camps, American soldiers challenged the core of their arrogance. Each act, however small, chipped away at the myth of honor that these generals clung to so desperately. The veneer of dignity, maintained through years of propaganda and battlefield intimidation, began to crumble under the weight of moral authority wielded with precision.
In those early days, the camps became classrooms of psychological warfare, where discipline and morality intersected. American soldiers discovered that the ultimate weapon was not firepower, but principle. By refusing to honor unearned respect, by treating these men as what they truly were, defeated and accountable, they delivered a quiet but powerful lesson. The gentleman's war was revealed as nothing more than a delusion, a thin mask over crimes too horrific to reconcile with notions of honor. The Americans realized that defeating the Third Reich required more than strategy and strength. It required clarity of conscience and the courage to confront arrogance wherever it appeared, even within the ranks of surrendering officers. Every encounter became a moral test, proving that true authority does not demand respect, it earns it.
The breaking point for American soldiers came with Ohrdruf, the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by U.S. forces. Just 30 miles from Eisenhower's headquarters, the camp presented a reality so horrific it was impossible to ignore. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower walked through the ruins, he was confronted by piles of bodies, skeletal survivors, and the remnants of industrialized murder. The stench of decay hung in the air, and the walls seemed to echo the silent suffering of thousands who had perished. Eisenhower knew that the world needed to see what had been done in its name, and he meticulously documented the atrocities, calling journalists and photographers to record evidence of crimes so extreme that they challenged comprehension. When some of the same high-ranking German officers who had previously demanded salutes and privileges were brought to Ohrdruf, the contrast could not have been more striking. Men who had once expected deference were now confronted with undeniable proof of the devastation their regime had wrought. Some appeared shocked, others tried to feign ignorance, claiming they had not known or not been responsible for the horrors surrounding them. Their carefully maintained arrogance began to crack, revealing a nervousness that American soldiers had never witnessed in battle. For the men on the ground, the experience was both enraging and empowering. They realized that these officers were not simply surrendering to an army. They were being forced to confront a moral truth far more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Accounts from Ohrdruf describe soldiers escorting German officers through barracks filled with skeletal survivors, piles of abandoned clothing, and evidence of mass executions. The American troops observed closely, noting the officers' reactions. Some attempted to maintain composure, but their rigid posture faltered, their eyes darting to avoid the truth staring them in the face. Whispers circulated among the soldiers, recounting how these generals, once commanding armies, now walked in silence through the very manifestations of the evil they had helped create. It was a scene of profound psychological reckoning. The camp became a stage for a larger moral lesson. Eisenhower, aware of the destructive pride that had driven these men to commit unimaginable atrocities, made clear to his commanders that the surrender of German officers would not be met with empty courtesies. There would be no salutes, no special treatment, no acknowledgement of honor that had already been violated. For the Americans, Ohrdruf was more than a liberation, it was a turning point in understanding the full scope of the enemy. The atrocities witnessed there validated every hesitation, every refusal to treat the generals with conventional respect. In the days following the initial inspection, American soldiers were instructed to enforce strict equality and discipline within the camps. Luxury and privilege, once demanded, were replaced with simplicity and routine. Officers were no longer allowed special quarters or privileges, and every gesture of expected deference was denied. The psychological impact on the German commanders was immediate. Their egos, carefully protected for decades, were stripped bare, and they were forced to reckon with their own irrelevance. Soldiers reported the disbelief on their faces, the subtle tremors in their hands, and the attempts to mask shame with thinly veiled anger.
Ohrdruf revealed a stark truth. Victory was not merely measured in territory gained or enemy forces captured. It was also measured in the moral clarity with which the Americans treated the defeated. By confronting German officers with the undeniable consequences of their actions, the U.S. military delivered a quiet but devastating lesson. These men had prided themselves on being the master race, but in the face of overwhelming evidence of their crimes, that delusion shattered. The camp became a place where the illusion of honor, carefully cultivated through propaganda and intimidation, was destroyed. For the soldiers on the ground, Ohrdruf left an indelible mark. They understood that their mission extended beyond liberation. It was about confronting evil and asserting moral authority. Every interaction with the captured generals after this point was informed by the stark reality of what had occurred there. Pride had been replaced by accountability, arrogance by silence, and the myth of a gentleman's war by the undeniable truth of human suffering. The breaking point had been reached, and the stage was set for the deliberate dismantling of the officers' egos, a process that would define the closing days of the conflict and the legacy of American discipline and moral judgment.
By the time Eisenhower and Patton issued their orders, the message was unmistakable. The high-ranking SS and Wehrmacht officers would no longer command the respect they had arrogantly demanded. Salutes, private quarters, special treatment, every privilege they had considered their due was to be denied. Eisenhower, deeply shaken by the horrors uncovered at Ohrdruf and other concentration camps, understood that these officers' pride had been one of the last pillars supporting their delusion of superiority. He wanted the American soldiers to deliver a lesson far more profound than words or weapons could convey: the deliberate dismantling of ego and entitlement. American troops carried out these instructions with a combination of precision and moral awareness. Every ignored salute, every refusal to engage in ceremonial courtesy was a calculated act designed to shatter decades of self-importance. Generals who had once demanded attention and obedience now found themselves powerless, stripped of symbols of authority. Reports from POW camps describe officers arriving with expectations of luxury, only to be met with routine quarters, standard rations, and the cold indifference of soldiers who had seen the true consequences of their commands. In many instances, German officers were made to confront the very consequences of the regime they had served. Soldiers escorted them past evidence of atrocities, showing them skeletal survivors, abandoned belongings, and the scars of towns devastated by Nazi policy. Some officers attempted to maintain composure, but their rigid posture betrayed discomfort. Others tried to assert authority through formal complaints or procedural arguments, but the Americans remained firm, enforcing equality and discipline without yielding an inch. Silence became a weapon. The absence of acknowledgement communicated far more than words could convey. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Men who had once considered themselves untouchable were now subject to the quiet authority of those they had underestimated. Even the most arrogant generals could not maintain their composure when confronted with the moral clarity of the Americans. Every small act of denial, the refusal to salute, the withholding of privileges, the insistence on routine, struck at the core of their identity. The so-called master race, which had thrived on intimidation and control, was forced to confront its impotence and irrelevance in the face of disciplined restraint. This deliberate humiliation was not intended as vengeance. It was methodical, purposeful, and ethical. Soldiers understood that mocking the defeated could be satisfying, but would not carry the same weight as measured, principled action. By adhering to rules and denying undeserved respect, they delivered a psychological blow that would linger far longer than any battlefield encounter. Many soldiers later recalled the moment when the general's expressions shifted from arrogance to quiet disbelief,
realizing that their years of dominance and intimidation meant nothing in this new reality. It was a moment of justice executed with precision, a moral reckoning that left no room for excuses, denial, or the illusion of superiority. For the American forces, it was a demonstration that victory was not only about force, but about justice, integrity, and accountability. The order of disrespect became a defining feature of the final phase of the European War. German officers, once accustomed to deference and entitlement, were reduced to ordinary men under the strict control of those they had sought to dominate. Their ego, carefully cultivated over decades, was dismantled piece by piece, and they were forced to reckon with the reality of their crimes. In this silence, in these small but deliberate refusals of honor, the Americans asserted a moral authority far stronger than any salute could convey. By denying recognition to those who demanded it most, they ensured that the last image of the Nazi elite would not be one of power, but of accountability, shame, and profound psychological defeat.
The silence of the Supreme Commander spoke louder than any words could. Eisenhower's refusal to salute or extend conventional courtesies to the captured German generals was more than protocol. It was a deliberate statement of moral authority. In a war defined by brutality, deception, and propaganda, these simple acts of restraint communicated a message that could not be ignored. Respect is earned, never demanded. The arrogant officers who had once commanded armies now found themselves powerless, stripped not of arms or rank, but of the one thing they prized most, the illusion of honor. For them, every quiet glance, every withheld gesture was a reminder that their status had been irrevocably diminished. American soldiers observed these men closely, noting subtle changes in posture, hesitation in speech, and the small signs of insecurity that had previously been invisible beneath layers of arrogance. The psychological impact was profound. Generals who had once intimidated thousands now walked silently through the very camps that bore witness to the suffering they had caused. They were forced to see the consequences of their actions firsthand, to confront evidence that could not be rationalized or ignored. It was a reckoning far more powerful than a court or a battlefield engagement, because it attacked the core of their identity. The legacy of these encounters extended far beyond individual humiliation. By denying unearned respect and refusing to participate in the charade of a gentleman's war, American soldiers established a new standard for accountability. Military discipline, long associated with hierarchy and protocol, was now being exercised in service of justice. Each deliberate act of non-compliance, turning a back, withholding a salute, enforcing ordinary treatment, became a lesson in ethical authority. Soldiers realized that power was not measured by fear, weapons, or rank alone, but by the courage to act in accordance with principle, even when dealing with defeated enemies. Historians would later note that these moments shaped post-war military conduct, influencing how POWs were treated and setting a precedent for balancing discipline with moral responsibility. The experience taught soldiers that victory is never complete when it exists solely in territory or surrender. It is fully realized only when the truth is acknowledged and justice is enforced, even quietly. In the shadow of destruction, the American forces demonstrated that restraint could be as powerful as aggression, and that moral authority could deliver blows far more lasting than those inflicted on the battlefield. The former German officers, stripped of privileges and confronted with their crimes, became unwilling witnesses to the principles that guided their captors. For the soldiers, the exercise of quiet authority offered a form of moral closure, a way to assert control in a war that had tested every limit of human endurance and ethical judgment. They were not cruel, they were deliberate.
By withholding respect, they highlighted the contrast between arrogance built on oppression and dignity rooted in discipline and justice. In the years following the war, these episodes became emblematic of the power of principle over pride. The arrogant SS generals and Wehrmacht officers, once convinced of their invincibility and superiority, were left with only the silence of their failure. They had demanded recognition, yet the Americans gave them none, proving that true authority rests not in fear or entitlement, but in moral clarity and disciplined action. The legacy of these encounters endures as a testament to the fact that confronting evil requires more than strength. It requires courage, restraint, and the steadfast refusal to grant respect where it has been forfeited. In the end, the final act of the European war was not only the surrender of armies, but the quiet, unyielding assertion of justice. Arrogance was met with silence, entitlement with equality, and illusion with truth. And in that silence, history recorded a lesson far more enduring than any battle, a lesson that honor must be earned. Pride can be dismantled without violence, and the moral authority of the righteous can withstand even the most audacious demands for respect. The defeated generals left the camps not as masters of men, but as witnesses to the quiet power of principle, a reminder that even in war, integrity cannot be conquered.